I hold back sometimes I don't. Yeah. I feel good sometimes I don't. Hey, God's plan. God's plan. Oh, hey, I didn't see you there. Sorry, I was just jamming out to God's Plan by Drake. It's a favorite of mine. Don't believe me? Check out the wall. Yep, right there next to MJ. I've been known to quote the song quite a bit in my classes. What actually fits in with what I want to talk to you about today, which is God's plan, specifically for the children of Israel and the plan for you and me. Let's check it out. We're currently continuing our Unit 1 discussions about ancient civilizations, and the Israelites are a civilization that is oftentimes overlooked by the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians. But they're very important, mainly because they are different from everyone else. And they have a significance for you and for me that can't be overlooked. But in order to understand their significance, we have to go back to the beginning. Now, we've talked about what happened after creation in the flood and Tower of Babel. And we know that early in the ancient world, many people were wandering. They were migrating, typically for their survival. And the way this worked was usually families would move for food. Remember, they're nomadic people who follow their food, generally as shepherds or herders. And in the Mesopotamian city of Ur, a man named Abraham is directly called by God in the book of Genesis. He calls Abraham to move from Mesopotamia, which had been home, to a region called Canaan. This was God's promised land. God also promises to Abraham that he will be the beginning of a new nation, God's chosen nation. God told Abraham that his descendants would become as numerous as the stars of the sky, and with that promise outlines his plan for all of Israel. Abraham was in disbelief. His wife, Sarah, and him were both very elderly, and they hadn't had kids yet. So for him to become a great nation seemed impossible, but God would quickly prove that all things are possible with him. And in order to show him that he was serious, he made a covenant with Abraham. A covenant is an ancient ritual that usually was done in business agreements. Basically, an animal would be cut in two, and both parties would walk between the cutout innards of that animal in order to symbolize that if either broke the agreement, the same thing should be done to them, that they should be cut apart. And God appears to Abraham in a flame and travels between those two parts of the animals. Therefore, God shows his covenant with Abraham, his promise to him, his plan. And this isn't the first time God has made a covenant. He made one with Noah in the past, saying he would never destroy the earth. And ever since the fall of man, God has also been promising that eventually he would redeem man from sin. And so the rest of the story of the Israelites shows God fulfilling his promises, fulfilling his plan. But that doesn't mean everything was all sunshine and roses for the people of Israel. See, Abraham was the first patriarch, or the family head. He was the first leader. And his son Isaac was the same, and Isaac's son Jacob did the same as Jacob, who literally wrestled with God, would become known as Israel. And therefore, this family became known as the Israelites, and they only grew in number. But again, they are nomadic herders. And when drought and famine encapsulated much of the land, Jacob and his family were forced to move to Egypt. Initially, the Israelites were well received within Egypt because of the work of Jacob's son Joseph, who was already the vizier for Pharaoh. But this would begin to change as a new Pharaoh took over and the Israelites grew in number. The next Pharaoh enslaved the Israelites, and over time, the Israelites were at the mercy of their Egyptian rulers. For hundreds of years, the people of Israel cried out to God, asking for deliverance. And yet, it didn't come, because it wasn't a part of God's plan yet. Enter Moses. Moses, an Israelite who was actually raised in the court of the Pharaoh, had fled out into the wilderness and was living as a shepherd when God appeared to him in a burning bush. God made a covenant with Moses and promised to deliver the Israelites from Egypt, using Moses as the leader to do so. God quickly fulfilled that promise, leading the Israelites out of Egypt. And he directly intervened. Remember last video when I referenced all of these difficulties and crazy situations that happened in Egypt in the Middle Kingdom? Those were most likely the plagues that God released on Egypt. Blood in the water, frogs, locusts, darkness, hail, death of the firstborn. There are records indicating such things happening in Egypt. And it's with that Moses was able to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. And after the crossing of the Red Sea, they were on their way to freedom, to return to the land that was promised to Abraham. The Exodus proved to the Israelites that God was real. He was present and he would deliver them. God made it clear that he loved the Israelites. He made it clear that there was a plan for them. And if they followed that plan, all would be good. All they had to do in return was follow his commands, which he gave to them very simply in the Ten Commandments. Written on stone tablets and given to Moses on Mount Sinai, this was the supreme law of the Israelites. And it only sets up a disappointing trend that will follow the Israelites through the rest of their history. But while Moses was receiving the Ten Commandments, many of the people turned away, creating their own god, a golden calf. In his rage, Moses smashed the Ten Commandments, symbolic of the fact that the Israelites would never truly follow God. Herein lies the greatest reflection of human nature. We are sinful, and no matter how hard they tried, they could never 100% follow God's will. This is why God punished them by having them wander in the wilderness for 40 years before they got into the Promised Land. And yet at that point, when they did follow his commands, God gave them the Promised Land through military conquest. This trend only continues throughout the rest of the ancient world. Following the leadership of Moses and Joshua after him, God instilled judges, prophet-like religious leaders who spoke on behalf of God. Because early Israel was a theocracy. God was in control. It was a government ruled by him. And so the book of Judges tells many different stories about when the Israelites didn't follow God, he allowed them to be invaded. But when they did follow him, he allowed them to be prosperous. And yet, for whatever reason, it's probably the sin inside them. The Israelites would never fully trust God or be 100% content. And as they continued to look at the nations around them, they saw that all of these nations had kings. And naturally, something you and I probably fall into too, they wanted to be like everybody else. And God finally relented and gave them the king Saul. But as God and his prophet Samuel warned the people, kings are bad. In the long run, they only care about themselves. Yet after Saul, we get the best possible king Israel ever could have asked for, David, a man after God's own heart. David, who had killed the Philistine general Goliath, was Israel's best king. During his reign, Israel built the massive capital city of Jerusalem, one of the largest in the ancient world. And for the most part, David was a great king, but he did have his slips. He is sinful. In a well-known incident of adultery, David was harshly punished by God. Yet during David's reign, Israel truly became a power at its time. And under the leadership of David's son Solomon, Israel would only continue to prosper. Because Solomon was given the gift of wisdom. Solomon is probably most famous during his reign for the construction of the temple, a massive house of worship for the Lord that was crafted with gold and wood from around the world. However, after the death of Solomon, a dispute over who should be the next king resulted in the division of the kingdom into two new states, Israel and Judah. Now, both of these kingdoms were supposed to house God's people. They were both technically Israelites. And yet, as the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles and 1st and 2nd Kings tell us, for the most part, Judah is really the one that follows in God's footsteps. The books tell the stories of different kings who followed God and those who didn't. And many of the ones who didn't were in Israel in the north, which is why Israel didn't last as long as Judah did. It's the same old story. They didn't follow God, so they were destroyed. In 586 BC, the Assyrians, the warlike people of Mesopotamia, invaded Israel and almost completely destroyed it. Judah, however, lasted another 200 years or so and was eventually invaded by the Babylonians in 586 BC. But they weren't completely destroyed. See, here once again we see the grace of God in his plan. Because the people of Judah, the remaining Israelites who would now be known as Jews, taken captive, and many of them were moved to Babylon. During this period called the Babylonian captivity, God preserved the Israelite people with the intent that eventually they would return home. The book of Daniel tells the stories of the Israelites living in Babylon. And for the most part, King Nebuchadnezzar was not very tolerant of the Jewish people. In fact, he wanted to convert them to the Babylonian ways. There's a number of stories that highlight this. My personal favorite is when Daniel and his friends are asked to be like the Babylonian people, to be trained in their ways. And they refuse to, and they stick to the strict Israelite diets. And in the process, they're actually healthier than the Babylonians. It's a small story, but it shows how they didn't have to give in to Babylonian culture, and that God's way was the right way. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who Nebuchadnezzar had thrown into the furnace because they wouldn't worship him, they survived that furnace by the grace of God. Once again, showing who was truly in control. And yes, there would be redemption for the Israelites. It came in the form of the Persians, the Medes, who, as Daniel had prophesied, came in, invaded, and took over the Babylonian Empire, as we unpacked in a couple videos ago. But the king of Persia, Darius, was actually very tolerant of religions, and in fact allowed for the Israelites to return home and rebuild Jerusalem. They rebuilt the walls and they rebuilt the temple. Once again showing that God did have a plan. Even though the people were probably deserving of destruction and captivity, God redeemed them. And yet they still couldn't follow. Which is probably why God allowed for the Romans to eventually conquer Jerusalem as well. And it was in this time that there were whispers of maybe the Messiah will come. The one God has promised to redeem. Maybe he's here to redeem them from the Romans. Well, the Messiah did come. Well, it was Jesus. And so many of the Jewish people didn't recognize that in their time because they wanted a militaristic leader who would rebel and deliver them from the Romans, just as Moses had delivered them from the Egyptians. But that's not why Jesus was there. And unfortunately, that's why there's a shift in the Jewish beliefs. That's why the Jews today are not the same as Christians today, because they're still holding out for a Messiah. And they don't understand that he already came. Regardless, this pattern continues of being able to follow God and not following God. And it's why in 70 AD, God allows the Romans to come in and basically destroy Jerusalem, including the temple. The destruction of the temple triggered an event called the diaspora, or the scattering of the Jewish people throughout the world. And it won't be until after World War II that the Israelites return to their home of Israel. All right, I get it. I just summarized the whole Old Testament in about 11 minutes. So what does that have to do with history? Well, again, we have to recognize that the Israelites are different from every other civilization. They're monotheistic, for one, or believe in one God. Everyone else was polytheist. It's also what they believed about their God, that their God would intervene and protect them and deliver them from tribulation. And he did. Show me another civilization where that happens. It doesn't. Historically, the Israelites also show us the impact of nomads and the movement of culture throughout different places in the world. They also show us the importance of having a strict legal code in the Ten Commandments in the book of Leviticus. These law systems will be copied by many civilizations for years to come. And within all of that, notice how many other civilizations are impacted directly by the Israelites. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and the Persians all were a part of this story. History confirms the Bible confirms history, yet again. You can't just leave that stuff out. So the Bible has value as a historical book. And once again, I encourage you to experience it for yourself. Not just the history, but all of the lessons and life impacts that are in here. It'll change your life. And yet in the midst of all of it, again, is the meaning it has for us and for our worldview. You see, the Israelites show us that God is real and God is present. God loves us. He will intervene into history to protect us. And yet at the same time, just like the Israelites, we're sinful. And no matter how hard we try, we can't follow 100%. And we fall away. Just as the Israelites were delivered from Egypt and delivered from Babylon, we're delivered from our sin. See, God follows through his promises. And he did by sending Jesus. He was the Messiah. Yes, he wasn't what was expected. Definitely not. But he got the job done. And he redeemed us from all of those sins. And so the Israelites might be the most important thing we cover all year, because they show us who God is. And they also show us who we are. They show the purpose for our life. And they show us the purpose for history. And as the chronicle of history continues to unfold, we're going to continue to see examples that point back to Jesus, that point back to the plan. We'll see people that follow the plan, and we'll see people that don't. And through it all, we'll see a God who continues to love us. While the plan culminated with Christ, there is more to that story. There's more that will unfold. But that is a story for another day. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.